Hello friends, you are welcome to Nationhood Podcast and to episode 2.3, The Local Scene in Europe. In the last two episodes, we discussed the origins and dominance of great power politics in 19th century Europe and how a climate of suspicion precluded the possibilities of long-lasting peace on the continent. Nationalistic fervor and demands for democracy fostered rivalry amongst European governments and bred distrust between Europeans and their governments. In this episode, we examine the socio-cultural evolutions that accompanied political revolutions in Europe during the 19th century. Hopefully, you will see the connections between local events and continental politics and perhaps agree that neither should be analyzed in isolation. And so, without much more ado, let us begin. Technically, the 19th century should be seen as a single period with temporal boundaries that span from January 1st, 1800 to December 31st, 1899. But in terms of cultural production, which refers to how societies express themselves and represent their identity in art, architecture, cuisine, dance, literature, music, poetry, science, sports, and technology, amongst others. Some scholars argue that we must look at the preceding and succeeding centuries to better understand the 19th. For this episode, however, it would suffice to concentrate on those forms of cultural production that dominated Europe within the temporal boundaries of the 19th century and, where necessary, refer to significant occurrences outside the period. Notably, the episode will focus on cultural changes in those European nations that colonized Africa and consequently redefined cultural expression amongst Africans. To this day, European culture is vibrant in Africa, spanning language and educational systems, art, music, and more. The first thing we would consider is philosophy. In this field, intense debates flourished on a variety of topics, ranging from religion and rationality to autocracy and democracy. Philosophers and other social thinkers exchanged ideas about things like the application of scientific methods to the study of human behavior and the natural world. Early in the 19th century, a British Enlightenment thinker called Jeremy Bentham identified language as the key that could unlock social equilibrium. Bentham was a lawyer and a philosopher, that is, an 18th century public intellectual. Using the law as an example, Bentham claimed that simplifying the language in which the law is written would make it more accessible and better understood by all and sundry. He argued that people who are enlightened about law would consciously shun law-breaking. In Bentham's opinion, the driving force of human behavior is the pursuit of pleasure, and, as a result, on questions of morality, people define right and wrong by the degree of pleasure or pain that their actions create. Therefore, the natural human inclination to seek pleasure would prevent law-breaking as people strive to avoid the pains of punishment. More generally, Bentham recognized that the individual's desire for happiness could conflict with society's happiness, and so he argued that in such cases, the principle of utility, or greatest happiness, should be observed. Bentham's principle of utility is known today as utilitarianism, and in a nutshell, it proposes that the best actions are those ones that bring the greatest happiness or benefits to the greatest number of people. The importance of Bentham's work is evident if we consider how societies are governed. In a democracy, for instance, utilitarianism is taken for granted because, regardless of the human tendency to put one's own interests first, it is anticipated that the only actions that will be taken, either by the rulers or the people, are those which would bring the greatest benefit to the greatest number. As a result, Bentham believed that the public interest could be guaranteed through the rule of the people. Furthermore, he believed that government institutions needed oversight, and so Even in a democracy, Bentham called for constant scrutiny from an informed and engaged public. You may recall from episodes 2.1 and 2.2 that as revolutions swept through 19th century Europe, liberals sought to replace monarchies with governments of the people. Similar ideas guided Bentham's thinking as he outlined principles for creating enlightened societies. In this pro-democracy context, we can imagine how attractive utilitarianism must have been to informed sections of the public in countries like Bentham's Britain. One of his chief collaborators was the Scot James Mill, a preacher and historian who later became a senior employee of the British East India Company. Although his ideas were very similar to Bentham's, scholars have pointed out important differences. For instance, on democracy, Mill believed that public interest would best be protected if enlightened representatives emerge via regular elections. Bentham, on the other hand, insisted that additional safeguards must be employed to prevent misrule by democratic institutions. Put differently, Bentham saw the people as the best protectors of democracy, while Mill believed that an enlightened ruling class was best suited to this work, although he excluded women from it. In Europe, where authoritarian rule was dominant, the ideas of Bentham and Mill were quite revolutionary. However, we must note that both men were not merely concerned with philosophical ideas, but also their practical application. In this latter regard, we have seen in the last two episodes that European rulers and their courts did not take kindly to sharing power, and whenever opportunity arose, those monarchs who lost power to revolution and liberal ideas were eager to claw it back. In France, for example, the royal house of Bourbon returned to the throne after Napoleon's downfall. In Britain, where the monarchy was constitutional and relied upon popular sovereignty through parliament, democratic participation was limited to males with property. Throughout the 19th century, the British Parliament gradually extended the right to vote or be voted for to males who did not already qualify by progressively lowering the property threshold for eligibility. British women, however, had to wait until the next century. As the academic G.L. Williams has observed, utilitarianism cannot claim that it singularly caused the legal, political, and social reforms seen in 19th century Britain. Still, Williams argues that the incremental extension of voting rights to British men more closely reflected the idea of protecting the public good through an enlightened middle class as proposed by Mills than Bentham's notion where a mistrusting public was expected to hold the ruling class accountable. Another important philosopher of the 19th century was John Stuart Mill, who built on the ideas of both Jeremy Bentham and his father, James Mill. Williams explains that unlike Bentham and the older Mill, who saw law as the main tool for transforming society, John Stuart's version of utilitarianism stressed individual liberty and the improvement of human character. Beyond protecting the people's interests, the younger Mill envisioned representative democracy and its opportunities for political participation as necessary basis for the intellectual, moral, and social development of the people. However, he identified public opinion and the majority rule of democracy as potential threats to the liberty of individuals. Consequently, Mill argued that civilized societies must protect individual liberties, but only insofar as the exercise of such liberties do not cause harm to others. Unlike his father, John Stuart Mill advocated for women to be enfranchised, and he argued that a society can only be considered free if it protects freedom of conscience, freedom of thought and feeling, freedom of opinion and sentiment, and just as important and inseparable from the foregoing, a free society must protect freedom of expression. Mill published these ideas and many others in an 1859 book titled On Liberty. In addition to espousing ideas for the beneficial governance of society, Bentham and Mills, father and son, made significant contributions to 19th century thinking in a variety of fields, including legislation, public health, and moral philosophy. The important thing to note is that regardless of disagreements on fine points, the underlying principle of their collective utilitarian philosophy was for individuals and society to pursue the greatest good for the greatest number possible. Other important British philosophers of the 19th century included William Whewell, whose ideas on the philosophy of science and ethics were popular but criticized by John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sidgwick, who was less well known to the public but revered by fellow philosophers as a luminary in the field of ethics. Elsewhere in Europe, philosophy also thrived. In France, Auguste Comte established links between science and philosophy, believing that society and human character could and would ultimately improve through the application of scientific methods. Comte encouraged the use of scientific methods to explain and predict social behavior, which we know today as sociology. In Germany, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche developed a reputation as a contrarian philosopher whose critical opinions on a variety of issues was at odds with the dominant views of his age. According to Robin Small, Nietzsche was critical of knowledge and its conceptions of truth and objectivity, of morality and its conceptions of good and evil, of philosophy and its conceptions of reality, and perhaps what is most popular for today, of religion and its conception of God. In all these areas, Small asserts that Nietzsche promoted those ideas which had been popularly rejected. Hence, on religion, he declared that God was dead. There is a great deal more we can explore on 19th century philosophy, such as the emergence of psychology from its shadow and establishment as an independent field, the growth of logic in mathematics, which gave birth to Boolean algebra, and the unification of the previously separated sciences of living things into the singular subject we now call biology. Let us pivot from these broad intellectual ideas that shaped 19th century Europe to more practical issues that everyday people had to contend with. We consider religion first and begin in France, where, according to an 1872 census, 98% of Frenchmen identified as Roman Catholics. In other words, France was a Catholic country. Although the church held much influence in previous centuries, it was a casualty of the French Revolution and suffered severe losses. The church had been very wealthy, but during the revolution, most of its property was confiscated and, amongst other indignities, the clergy were forced to swear allegiance to the French state rather than to the Pope. Failure to comply meant persecution or death. But in 1801, when Napoleon was in power, an agreement called a Concordat was reached with the Pope. The Concordat, which was formally declared in 1802, restored some respectability to the church, but ensured that the state continued to call the shots. For example, Napoleon refused to return the property seized from the church, but offered to pay appropriate salaries to parish priests and bishops. He also retained the right to appoint the latter. As of 1814, when the Bourbons were first restored to power, the French priesthood had decreased to 50% of its pre-revolutionary number, with 30% over the age of 60 and 15% of parishes without a priest. However, with the support of successive governments in post-revolutionary France, the church gradually grew in strength during the 19th century. Throughout the period, the primary goal of the clergy was to rekindle French spirituality and to control secular conduct through morality. The Bishop of Arras, for instance, told his priests in 1852 to refuse absolution, that is, forgiveness, to anyone who visited a bar. Conservatism also extended to the economic sphere, as the church denounced any desire to acquire land and money as materialistic, particularly when it interfered with church attendance. It also campaigned against contraception on the basis that sex was for procreation alone. But the church did not always have its way, so it often blamed its waning influence on the moral weakness of the people and not on its own structural shortcomings. There were significant religious minorities in 19th century France. These were mostly Protestants of the Lutheran and Calvinist denominations, who numbered 500,000 in 1815 and continued to grow in number during the period. Roger Price explains that, like Catholics, Protestants also faced moral confusions that arose from the opposition of religious doctrine to the secular lives of adherents. Yet, their main concern was with maintaining their identity amidst an overwhelmingly Catholic majority. They did this by living in separate quarters, operating their own schools, and marrying within their faith. France also had a sizable Jewish community numbering 60,000 in 1815. They engaged in a variety of professions, but the Jews developed repute as money lenders, which generated anti-Semitic feelings towards them. Unlike Catholic France, Germany was largely Protestant, but quite like France, religious fervor in Germany was also on the decline in the early 19th century. However, this was not due to political uprising, but to an intellectual revolution that had begun in the previous century. Championed by prominent Lutheran theologians, ideas of rationality spread amongst priests and the populace, such that religion became more of a mechanism for achieving individual wisdom and morality, and lost its appeal as a system of faith-based doctrines. Hence, one expert argues that 19th century Germans widely rejected miracles and superstitious practices as antithetical to common sense, irrelevant to modern life, and injurious to personal virtue. Ida Sagara observes that these attitudes were not exclusive to German Protestants, as many Catholics held similar views. As a result of this theological rationalism, the reverence for religious authority that typically defined Catholicism was mellowed by a greater individualism and doctrinal tolerance. Paradoxically, interest in religion was revived by war with France, as German rulers sought a rallying point upon which they could build patriotic fervor to resist the French, who had rejected God, persecuted the clergy, and also killed their king, the representative of God on earth. We discussed the beheading of King Louis XVI in part 1 of episode 2.1, and you can go check it out to learn more about that tragic event. After the fall of Napoleon, the revival of German interest in religion remained a tool that conservative forces used to maintain social cohesion. Clergy who aided in establishing the ruling class's political authority over the church found rapid social and theological advancement. The idea was for the people under religious authority to be politically docile and follow the directions of the clergy. This really meant they could be bent to the will of political rulers. In the German state of Prussia, for instance, the relations between church and state grew so strong that when Berlin was nearly overrun by liberals in 1848, the Prussian king styled the work of crushing the rebels as a divine task. As Sagara describes it, the church and faith became foundational for sustaining social and political harmony, while serving as barriers to revolutionary ideas. When Prussia emerged as a global power in the latter half of the 19th century, God was considered central to the process as the clergy prayed for geopolitical success. Prussia defeated Austria in 1864, conquered France in 1871, and subsequently unified the numerous German states into an empire under the leadership of its king Wilhelm, who then took the title of Kaiser. Ever close to the state, the church ascribed these geopolitical successes to God's pleasure in German virtue. You can check out the rise of Prussia in part 2 of episode 2.1. One major takeaway from our discourse on religion in 19th century Europe is that it was intricately tied with national interest. When it was expedient, revolutionary France tried to erase religion in pursuit of a nationalist agenda, and in the German states, where religion was already in decline due to widespread secular thinking, religious fervor was readopted as a bulwark to protect nationalist interests. Obviously, France and Germany do not represent all of 19th century Europe, but the idea here is to present broad examples from leading nations. In Britain, for instance, Anglicanism was well established as a state religion with the monarch as its head. Moving on from the intangibilities of philosophy and religion, we now consider tangible forms of European expression like science and the arts. Let's start with the arts. Again, the objective is not to survey every single kind of artistic expression in 19th century Europe, but to outline local life on the continent in the century prior to the colonization of Africa. Harry Heder has argued that the most successful art form in 19th century Europe was the novel. Between 1830 and 1880, the novel reached previously unattained heights. In Heder's view, music, poetry, painting, sculpture, and architecture were all evident, but it was in the novel that European creativity sparkled. Across all of these art forms, two major ideological viewpoints battled for ascendancy. There were the Romantics, whose movement traced its origins to the 18th century and sought to counter Enlightenment ideas of rationalism. And there were the Realists, who rejected Romanticism for its sentimentality and permissiveness in exaggerating the artist's perspective. Where rationalism depicted things with scientific exactitude, Romanticism stressed personal perceptions, often based on emotions. Realism, on the other hand, focused on the struggles of everyday people. Thus, the Romantic might stress the nobility of war, but the Realist would describe the horrors of the battlefront. Some works from these genres remain popular today and have even taken new forms. For example, the novel Les Miserables was written in 1862 by the Frenchman Victor Hugo and has numerous adaptations, including a modern musical variant that, according to its website, has been staged in 53 countries and translated into 22 languages since 1980. A film adaptation was produced in 2012, winning 3 of 8 Academy Award nominations, and a remastered version was scheduled for release in February 2024. Les Miserables, which means the wretched or miserable ones, exemplifies Romanticism. Its main character is a former criminal who risks jail again by breaking parole, but goes on to display the best characters of humanity while on the run. This sentimental depiction of the human character is set in post-Napoleonic France and serves as a rebuke to the stiff rationalism of the philosophers and the French Revolution. As a work of art, Les Miserables is arguably one of the greatest masterpieces of all time, and its romanticism captured 19th century popular imagination through rhetoric and drama. Another romantic was Alexandre Dumas the Elder, author of famous works The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. Also eminent were the Russian novelists Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace in 1866, and Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose Crime and Punishment was published the same year. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were realists and used their work to depict social problems like the poverty of the masses. In Britain, Charles Dickens was renowned for his realist presentation of working-class people in Oliver Twist, as well as his sentimentalism in A Christmas Carol. Amongst novelists, female writers like George Eliot and Emily Bronte created popular heroines in Adam Bede and Wuthering Heights, respectively. Heder also identifies the 19th century as the period when the nonsense story emerged. One example is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which was written in 1865 and remains popular today. In poetry, Heder argues that the greatest works of the 19th century were produced in the Romantic style and before 1830, by Goethe in Germany, Foscolo in Italy, and Byron in England. Like the aforementioned literary works, 19th century music was dominated by Romanticism, but unlike written works, music was publicly consumed in the theatre and at the opera. In this sphere, Berlioz was the leading composer in France, while Germany was first dominated by Mendelssohn, then later by Wagner and Brahms. Italy had Verdi. Painting was dominated by the French Impressionist movements and was led by the artists Monet and Manet. This style of painting emphasized the movement of light and the landscape rather than the precision of the subject. Later on, the Dutchman Vincent van Gogh would rise to prominence in the Impressionist tradition. Regardless of the creativity of European artists, we must not assume that the enjoyment of their works was widespread. Most 19th century Europeans were poor peasants engaged in rural agriculture or laborers working for paltry wages in urban centers. Although conditions varied by country, certain commonalities existed. For example, the urban poor tended to work long hours and live in unsanitary conditions, usually in filthy slums. In terms of diet, poor Europeans did not enjoy variety. Instead, bread and potatoes were the staples. Meat was rarely enjoyed, and fish even less so. Clothing was also basic. The growth of industrialization and factory production attracted labor from rural areas, and this worsened urban living conditions. It was not uncommon for urban workers to toil more than 15 hours daily, and like men and women, children also labored. Despite these tough working conditions, some familiar features of today's workplace trace their origins to the 19th century. Things like trade unions, compulsory limits on regular working hours, and the abolition of child labor, as well as public health measures that emphasize sanitation. For European upper classes, however, life was much better as they enjoyed a variety of luxuries, ranging from multiple course meals and the latest fashion to elite activities like horse racing, playing musical instruments, reading, and writing. Before the Enlightenment movement of the 18th century, education in Europe had largely been a matter for the ruling classes. By the 19th century, however, systems of state education were being developed to educate all classes. Education had been a core responsibility of the churches, but in 1806, Napoleon passed a law that became the foundation for the development of France's national education system. In the German states, churches retained some control of education, but under the guidance of the state. In neighboring France, girl education was poorly funded compared to boys, but in Germany, it was compulsory for both sexes to receive an education. Despite the general emphasis on education, the upper classes received the best of it. In France, lycées were created, while Germany had gymnasiums. In contrast, universal education was not achieved in Britain until late in the 19th century. Prior to this, the existing system of public and grammar schools had been monopolized by the British upper classes. In terms of higher education, the British also had fewer universities per capita compared to France, Germany, and even Italy. In the 19th century, science experienced significant advancements and the natural sciences became prominent, particularly biology, physics, and chemistry. A leading light in the theories underlying natural science was the Frenchman Auguste Comte, who we mentioned earlier, for creating links between science and philosophy. Comte promoted the scientific method of observation as the best source of truth. This is known as positivism, which means that the purest truths are those phenomena which can be observed. In terms of applying the insights obtained from natural sciences to the solution of human problems, the 19th century saw many exciting developments. Michael Faraday's tests in electromagnetics laid the groundwork for further experiments with electricity. As Heather explains, its first practical application was in the electric telegraph, which used electrical pulses to transmit signals, permitting communication over previously unimaginable distances. Other notable scientists with a legacy on electricity include James Clerk Maxwell, who advanced theories on both electromagnetism and thermodynamics, as well as Georg Simon Ohm, whose last name is the unit of electrical resistance. Regardless, these discoveries in physics did not have much impact or importance for the wider European society. Germ theory was developed by Louis Pasteur, establishing that germs were the root cause of most diseases. This revolutionized the treatment of sicknesses and the prevention of infections. By inventing the process of pasteurization, which uses heat to kill germs, Louis Pasteur enabled the purification of things like milk and wine, which elongated their shelf life, as well as presumably human life. Building on the theories of Pasteur, Joseph Lister pioneered the use of antiseptics in surgery, a process in which wounded patients were previously at great risk of dying from infected injuries. In Herder's analysis, however, the scientist who made the biggest splash in the 19th century was the naturalist Charles Darwin. Darwin expanded the concept of evolution with his theory of natural selection based on extensive observations in the fields of geology and the biological subfields of botany and zoology. Through his book, The Origin of Species, Darwin challenged existing ideas of man's place in the world, and the books spread far and wide. Throughout the 19th century, Europe was in a state of evolution, from politics and culture to philosophy, religion, education, arts, and science. It can be rightly considered that the 19th century was an age of ideas. Whereas the upper classes remained at the core of political and intellectual developments, the doors were cracked open for the masses of Europe to participate, even if in a limited fashion. Hence, the push for greater political participation was accompanied and even fueled by greater engagement in the socio-cultural developments of the age. While the participation of the poor in fields like the arts may have been limited, the conditions of their existence were frequently the subject of prose, poetry, and paintings. Similarly, the benefits of improvements in public health became more widespread, even if the chief promoters were the ruling classes. The push for universal education increased opportunities for the masses to participate in the rapidly industrializing economies of Europe. However, it was the ruling classes who oversaw education, and by also controlling the factors of production, they controlled the economy as well. In this episode, I have shared a social history of 19th century Europe to complement earlier episodes about politics on the continent. This brief socio-cultural view is necessary for an understanding of how Europeans justified colonization. For example, Britain came to see slavery as barbaric and abolished its practice across the British Empire in 1833. The need to do this was, amongst other things, justified by a proclaimed desire to protect the humanity of every man, regardless of race. But under the guise of spreading civilization to what Europeans called the Dark Continent, Britain played a leading role in depriving African societies of their pre-colonial sovereignty and split the continent into colonies alongside France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, and Spain. Perhaps the drive to embark on this venture was linked to European conceptions of what equal humanity meant, which may have been limited in scope by the European experience of class differences and the spread of Darwin's ideas about the survival of the fittest. As a final note, I would like to add that one major problem with writing histories of Europe in the 19th century is that the abundance of material makes it difficult to choose what to include and what to exclude without deviating from the objective at hand. For this episode, I have focused on France, Germany, and Britain, who all played major roles in the colonization of Africa, and without geographic specification, I have made some broad generalizations about the continent of Europe that are also relevant to former colonizers like Portugal, Spain, and Italy, as well as to non-colonizing nations like Russia and Poland, who were key players in the political, socio-cultural, and economic development of Europe, and thus are relevant to our knowledge of the period. Next time, we would paint the final portion of the picture that completes our view of Europe in the 19th century by tracing the arc of economic development on the continent and beyond, as with the political and socio-cultural influences that molded Europe as a colonizer. We would examine the economic imperatives that sealed Africa's fate as the colonized.